Good evening or afternoon to all friends of Yad Vashem who have logged in today. We are very privileged indeed to have as our guest tonight Professor Yehuda Bauer. Almost needs no introduction, but he is the world-renowned doyen of Holocaust scholars. Professor Bauer is Professor Emeritus of History and Holocaust Studies at the Avraham Harman Institute of Contemporary Jewry at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, and he is Academic Advisor to Yad Vashem. Born in Prague, Czechoslovakia in 1926, his family migrated to Israel in 1939. In 1998, he was awarded the Israel Prize, the highest civilian award in Israel. In 2001, he was elected a member of the Israel Academy of Science. Professor Bauer has served as advisor to the Task Force for International Cooperation on Holocaust Education, Remembrance and Research, and is also senior advisor to the Swedish government and the International Forum of Genocide Prevention. I just want to add one more short note, and that is this week, the President Steinmeier of Germany has made a public statement, which has been in the newspapers, that in every German family, if they investigated their parents, grandparents, or whatever, every single German family would have one member at least who was involved in the Holocaust. And that is a bit of a sad and shocking situation. So I don't want to further say anything other than to introduce Professor Yehuda Bauer, who is going to lecture us tonight on the start of Operation Barbarossa in 1941. Professor Bauer, please.
Thank you very much, Michael. My topic is more complicated than it sounds, actually. Of course, Barbarossa was the name of, or the nickname of a German emperor of the 12th century who made a crusade to the west, to the east, to the Holy Land at that time. The German expansion in Europe, which started with the outbreak of the war in 1939, as we all know, caused the collapse of France in June 1940. And what people know, especially in the United Kingdom, of course, is that afterwards there was the Battle of Britain over the skies of Britain, with the Germans trying to get air superiority so they could invade. But that actually happened in the main in August and September 1940. And even before that, in July 1940, Hitler gave the first instruction to prepare an invasion of the Soviet Union. So that this was not dependent on the defeat of the German Air Force over Britain. It preceded it. And while the Battle of Britain was going on and the possibility of a German invasion still existed, the plans began to take form. And on December 18, 1940, Hitler gave the instruction to prepare a practical proposal for an invasion of the Soviet Union that should become in the very near future. The background, the immediate background to that was the defeat of, practical defeat, although then it is supposed victory, of the Soviet forces in a war against Finland, which began in 1939 and ended in 1940 in March, with a tremendous superiority in numbers of the Soviet forces, of course. But the Finns managed to defeat Soviet forces for 3 months until they were finally overrun by the huge number of that faced them on the other side. But that left in the German minds the idea that the Russian colossus, this tremendous armed force, was in fact very poorly trained and would not be a major opponent to the tremendously successful, until that times, German army. Now, there was this was one of the major mistakes of the German planning. And one has to say that looking at the intelligence services of the Germans at the time, they knew very little about the Soviet preparations. So this actually is very peculiar because there was no problem really to penetrate the Soviet Union and report. But we know today from the material of the German military intelligence, that they had information about the Soviet forces that faced them immediately in Poland, where half of Poland had been occupied by the Germans in 1939 and the other half by the Soviets. And the Soviet armies that was on the other side of the border were very large in number, but the Germans thought that they would be easily overrun. And what happened beyond that in the vast expanses of the Soviet Union and in the preparations that the Soviets were making was not really known to the Germans. For Hitler, the invasion of the Soviet Union was a primarily ideological effort. And on March 30, 1941, when the preparations for the invasion were already very advanced, he met with the top leadership of the German army and explained to them that this was not an ordinary war. This was an ideological war where no quarter would be given, where as many Soviet soldiers, etc., that could be annihilated, should be annihilated. The preparations of the German army were tremendous. And the idea was that the Soviet Union should be defeated and in part occupied, and then the British Empire would collapse of itself because there would be no more allies to the British. The Americans had a neutrality law that prevented in the future any kind of American involvement in European wars. And the Germans were convinced that the British Empire would collapse once the Soviet Union was occupied. The military preparations led to the establishment, or the deployment rather, of 153 German divisions, of whom 19 were panzer divisions, in other words, equipped with tanks and advanced mechanical equipment. There were 3,350 tanks and more that were at the in German hands, and there were 3,000 planes that would accompany the German invasion, just as they had in France, where the German Air Force had been a very major factor in the defeat of the French army. In addition, Hitler's people made alliances, and Hitler himself, with the Finns in the north and the Romanians in the southeast. There would be 14 Finnish and 13 Romanian divisions that would be added to the 153 divisions, German divisions. Altogether, there would be 3.8 million men, a few women, who would be the force that would invade the Soviet Union. What stood against them? The Soviets had, contrary to the knowledge that the Germans thought they had been preparing. And Stalin actually, in early 1940, said to the top leadership of the Soviet army that he wanted to keep another 2 years for a preparation for the inevitable clash with the German army. And in the meantime, the Soviets would prepare the ground for such a conflict. There was no idea of a Soviet preemptive strike against the German army. That would be impossible, contrary to some historians who afterwards claimed there was such a plan, but there wasn't. The Soviets had, when the Barbarossa started on 22nd of June 1941, they had 186 divisions in the first line opposite the German forces in Poland. Now you see, these 186 divisions were confronting some 170 divisions of the Germans. In other words, there was a superiority, numerical superiority of the Soviets. But these divisions were in the process of being built up. They lacked proper equipment. They had lots of tanks. They had a tremendous amount of tanks available, over 14,000 tanks. But they were under-equipped. They were lacking fuel. There were no proper communications. And the main thing that was missing was a leadership, a military leadership that would know what they were doing, because Stalin had been misled by a very, very clever attempt by the Germans to suggest to the Soviet intelligence that acted in Germany that the leadership of the Soviet army was in touch with the Gestapo in Germany and was out to topple Stalin. And Stalin believed that. And in 1937, there was a purge of the top leadership of the Soviet army, not only the top leadership, 3 top ranks of the leadership of the Soviet army were annihilated. The Soviet marshals, except for 2, were killed, were executed. The colonels, the generals, were either dismissed or killed or put into concentration camps. And after 1938, Stalin had to rebuild an army. And by 1941, many of the people who had been dismissed in 1937, 1938 because of the purge were reinstated, but they had been mistreated, maltreated in concentration camps. They were not really prepared for a war. Now, the equipment on paper was tremendous. Not only those 14,000 tanks that I mentioned. Some of those tanks were superior to anything the Germans had in terms of tanks, especially tank T-34. It's a huge tank that the Germans had no tank to face it. But there were not enough of those. And they were not properly equipped. And they lacked commanders who would direct them. The Soviets had 16,000 aircraft, military aircraft. But those military aircraft were not properly equipped either. They lacked fuel, they lacked leadership. And the Germans did have intelligence enough to know the immediate line of Soviet defense that faced them. What they didn't know, the Germans, was that there was a second line of defense along the big rivers, the Dnieper and the Dniester in the east, and the Don, where there were another 51 Soviet divisions who were better trained, who would be sort of second line if the Germans managed to break through. The Soviets had warnings of the German invasion. They should not have been surprised. There was a major Soviet spy in Japan who reported to the Soviets because the Germans had informed the Japanese about their plans to invade the Soviet Union. And on the eve of the invasion of 22nd of June, 1941, on the eve of that, a couple of days before that, there was a German deserter, a communist, who crossed the lines and informed the Soviets of the impending attack. Stalin didn't believe him. He was being interrogated by the Soviets when the attack on the Soviet Union already started. Now, when the attack started, the German Air Force, in the first 3 days, managed to annihilate 3,500 Soviet aircraft, mostly on the ground, some on the air. But that came at a price. Already then, the first days of a successful invasion. By July 5th of 1941, the Germans had lost 495 planes, with another 316 damaged. And in the middle of July 1941, during the big advance of the German forces in the Soviet Union, the German aircraft, the German Air Force over the Soviet Union had been reduced by 30%. And the top leadership of the German army, the big generals, began to be very, very worried. And the chief of the general staff of the German army, Fritz Halder, in the middle of July 1941, wrote to his colleagues that the offensive was going very badly, that there was much more Soviet resistance than they had thought. And there indeed was unsuccessful resistance. But the Soviets constantly counterattacked. All these counterattacks were defeated. And the German armies advanced in what seemed to be a tremendous, successfully executed attack. And yet, in effect, the German advance was slower than planned. Minsk, the capital of Belarus, was reached very quickly. The offensive, as I said, started on the 2nd of June. By 6 days later, the capital of Belarus was already occupied. And the German forces advanced in the north towards Leningrad, today St. Petersburg. And Leningrad was supposed, according to German plans, was to be overrun, annihilated. That was Hitler's order. Annihilated. Because that was a center of Soviet military production. And the population more or less exterminated. And then the road will be free for the occupation of the rest of the Soviet Union. The idea was to occupy, first of all, the Ukraine, because of the riches of the Ukraine, not only agricultural production, but the coal and the iron in the Donbass, in the area of eastern Ukraine, and the oil of the Caucasus, which was crucial for the Germans. And the idea was to, first of all, attack there. And they occupied Kiev in September 1941. And then on the 26th of October, they occupied Kharkiv today. In other words, in the eastern Ukraine already. It seemed to be very quick. And yet the Soviets, although they had tremendous losses, and millions of Soviet soldiers were taken prisoner, about 3.5 million, of whom at least a third died in the first few months of being prisoners of war, because the Germans didn't feed them properly, and they died of hunger, starvation, disease, terrible condition. Nevertheless, the Soviets managed, while the Germans were advancing, to recruit from the huge population of the Soviet Union additional millions of soldiers who were being prepared for opposing the Germans as the Germans advanced. Now, this is a general picture, and it ended in a way, the first stage of the Barbarossa, when the autumn arrived, with its rain, which turned the roads into mud, and the German tanks were bogged down, and there were not enough horses to draw the artillery, and there were the Germans had prepared for a short war, which by the autumn was supposed to be over, and it wasn't over. There wasn't enough equipment, and the communications were difficult, because the railways in the Soviet Union had a different type of rails than Germany had, and German railways had to wait until the rails of the railways were fitted for German railways to pass through. And these technical problems created a situation where the winter arrived, and the German soldiers were not equipped for the winter, because they were not supposed to fight in the winter. And the Soviet opposition stiffened. In the east, the German offensive, although successful, occupied Ukraine, but did not advance towards the Caucasus at that point, because the Soviet opposition was too strong. And the attempt to take Moscow was stopped by a tremendous effort of a actually numerically inferior Soviet force, helped by winter, helped by the climatic situation. And then at the beginning of December, when the German offensive against Moscow had stopped, the Soviets had brought in 30 divisions from Siberia, from the Japanese area, because they were convinced that the Japanese would not attack, and indeed they didn't. And those 30 divisions were very well equipped. And on the 5th of December, 1941, the big Soviet counteroffensive started. It pushed the Germans back by about 150, 200 kilometers. This was not a German defeat, but it was the beginning of a defeat. The Soviets had to stop. They did not have enough forces to force the Germans any further. But Barbarossa had stopped. A completely new situation had arrived. Now, I started with a military situation, but you see, you can't deal with the Soviet invasion of the Soviet Union just from a military point of view. That's totally hopeless. The question arises, and the question seldom, including by most of my colleagues, historians, who deal with great detail in the military diplomatic situation before the outbreak of war in 1939, in the area between 1939 and 41 with the Barbarossa invasion. All that is very well covered. But the question has to be asked: why did the Germans attack anyone. Why did they start a war? And the answer is much more complicated than you might think. Because as the people, the journalists and the diplomats, foreign diplomats, who were stationed in Germany, Nazi Germany at the time, reported unanimously. The German population believed Hitler when he said that he would have tremendous victories without a war. They didn't want a war. They wanted victories, but without a war. Why? Well, it's very obvious. This is only 20 years after the end of First World War. Millions of German soldiers had fallen. There were millions of widows. There were millions of former soldiers, wounded people, people who could no longer work properly. And the German population didn't want a war. There was an exception, of course. There was the youth who had grown up in the 1930s under Nazi rule. And they too didn't want a war, but they were quite sure that Hitler, the Führer, would lead them to victory without a war. And they said so. And they said so openly. And Hitler supported that illusion in his tremendously successful speeches as a charismatic speaker. And what happened then was that there was no pressure from the population on the leadership to start a war. Maybe the capitalists, you know, the people who own the banks and the big industries, who in large numbers, most of them supported the Nazi regime. Did they want a war? We now have detailed insight into the archives of these organizations. And we know for certain, yes, they would have liked to eliminate Czechoslovakia and Poland, but they didn't want a war, because by 1936, and the date is very important, by 1936, German industrial production had reached the level of before the 1929 world economic crisis. And so real wages were not rising because there was rearmament. But millions of Germans worked now. Unemployment went down, practically disappeared. And people came home with paychecks, no longer relying on handouts from the government, but bringing home, as a result of work, paychecks. And so the big industries could utilize the work of these workers, and they expanded exports, not only to Southeast Europe in the 1930s and after, especially 1936, but to the Soviet Union, because the Soviets, with their 5-year plans, needed machinery and know-how. And the best place to get that was Germany. And so despite the ideological war between Bolshevism and Nazism, there were German exports to the Soviet Union that were extremely profitable for the German industries. They didn't want a war. A war would destroy these things, wouldn't they? And so while the German leadership, the business leadership, the bank leadership, while they wanted to eliminate Czechoslovakia and Poland for nationalistic reasons, but not with a war, you know, but by other means. And to attack the Soviet Union was no, what for? Well, did the German army want a war? Yes, German army wanted a war. Against who? Against Czechoslovakia and Poland. But not a two-front war, because a two-front war they wouldn't win. They would be defeated just as in the First World War. And in the discussions that were held, and we now have all the documents available, between the top leadership of the German army and the Nazi leadership. The leadership of the German army said, yes, if we can have a war against Czechoslovakia, which sort of projects its rather impressive military equipment into the area of German superiority, and to take away from the Poles Western Poland, which is largely settled by Germans. If we can do that without a two-front war, we are in favor. But that was impossible because there had been, in the eyes of the German military. Why? Because in 1934, the French made an agreement with Czechoslovakia, a military agreement for mutual help, where the French would help the Czechs if the Czechs were attacked by Germany. In 1935, there was a military agreement between France and the Soviet Union on the same basis. And there was a military agreement with the Soviet Union and the Czechoslovak Republic the same year. Now, there were no common borders between the Soviet Union and Czechoslovakia, and certainly not with France, of course. But there was this three agreements, these threefold agreements, and they were public. And the Germans, of course, knew every detail of it because they had been made public. And the German military leadership said to the Nazi leadership, as long as that is the case, we are against the war because we would be defeated. And Hitler insisted, I want a war against Czechoslovakia. The Czechs had at that point a potential army of 2.5 million people, soldiers. But many of these people were Germans in the Czech area and Hungarians in the Slovak area who did not like the Czechoslovak Republic. So it was a problematic thing, but the Czechs had tremendous defenses on the borders against Germany. So the German military leadership said, we don't want to play ball with this. And in August, the 18th of August, 1938, the German Chief of Staff, Ludwig Beck, resigned his post in protest against the Hitler program of attacking Czechoslovakia because he said we would lose that war because France and the Soviet Union would enter it. And another person was established as Chief of Staff, a general by the name of Fritz Halder, who knew that Beck, the one who resigned, was preparing a putsch against Hitler. He was not part of the putsch, but he knew about it and did not report to Hitler. And Beck prepared a putsch against Hitler. The idea of the putsch was to depose Hitler and to establish a nationalist, conservative military regime in Germany, not a democracy. One that would not enter into this kind of this kind of useless attack against forces that were bigger than the forces that Germany could muster. Now that putsch never took place. It was prepared. We know all the details of it because after the war, all these secret contacts were exposed. There was a representative of the putsch people in Britain. There was another one in France to create a kind of a atmosphere where this putsch could take place without intervention by the Western powers. But then you see, this is August 1938. And in September, Hitler managed to do the Munich agreement, that Chamberlain in Britain and Daladier in France yielded to the German demands against Czechoslovakia, and Czechoslovakia found itself alone. Nobody would help them, not the French with whom they had an agreement, and not the Soviets who were far away. And so the Czechs capitulated, and Hitler won without a war. And he practically split Czechoslovakia and annihilated it politically. Now, you don't revolt, you don't make a putsch against a successful dictator. And so the putsch never took place. Had it taken place, I doubt very much whether it would have succeeded, for technical reasons that I don't want to go into. But the idea of the German army supporting Hitler in his idea of an attack is at least problematic. The German army was prepared for that, but not under the conditions that existed in 1938. So, who wanted a war under any circumstance? So the obvious answer is Hitler. But it's not alone Hitler, of course. The whole leadership of the Nazi party. He was supported by a large number of people in Germany. Why did he want a war? He could have gotten the coal and the iron of the Ukraine and the oil of the Caucasus from the Soviets. Stalin would have crept on his belly to Berlin to prevent a war in 38, 39, 40. He was not prepared for it. He was preparing for it, but he wasn't prepared for it. He could have gotten, Hitler could have gotten it without any problem. So why did he want a living space in the East when he didn't need it? Is there an answer to that? And you know, I think there is. Because there is a document which we have known since the Nuremberg trial. It's a Nuremberg document of the only memorandum that Hitler ever wrote himself, or rather dictated himself. From August 1936, the date is so important because that's the time when the German industrial production, as I said before, had reached the level, pre-crisis level of 1929. And he tasked Goering, he would declare it publicly in October, 3 months after that, to prepare Germany for war in a plan, in a 4-year plan. The 4-year plan was made public. Why did he want a war in 4 years' time? Now, they had a discussion, Hitler and Goering, number 2 in the hierarchy, in August 1936. And apparently, Goering asked Hitler to have the instructions in writing so that he would have something to go on. An economic program of 4 years, Goering was no expert in economics, but he had plenty of experts who would help him, including the top economic expert in Germany at the time, the head of the Central Bank of Germany, Hjalmar Schacht, who supported Goering and Hitler in this. So he had experts. He needed a document to show him what to do. And that document exists, as I said. It's been translated into English at the Nuremberg trials. It was published by the Federal Republic of Germany in 1977 in its original. It was found after the war in the papers that were uncovered by the Allies. And in that memorandum, which is couched in the first person singular, I advise, I tell you what to do. In other words, Hitler telling Goering what to do. Hitler explains to Goering why a war is needed. Let me now quote the English translation from that memorandum. It says that crucial part of the memorandum says, this is typically Hitler language, by the way, because the man didn't know his own language. His expression in German is very faulty. Nevertheless, this is a translation, the authenticated translation. Since the beginning of the French Revolution, the world has been drifting with increasing speed towards a new conflict, whose most extreme solution is named Bolshevism, whose content and aim is only the removal of those strata of society which gave the leadership to humanity up to the present, and their replacement by international Jewry. For a victory of Bolshevism over Germany would not lead to a Versailles Treaty, but to the final destruction, even the extermination of the German people. Now you see, it's clear as day. The enemy is Bolshevism. Bolshevism is Jewish. And the aim of Bolshevism is to create a world ruled by international Jewry. That is the reason why we need a war. Okay? Now, I don't like sort of monocausal explanations. I don't argue that that was the only reason for the outbreak of war. But there's no doubt, and you saw it from, or you heard it from me just now, when I described the military development, that this was then reflected by Hitler in the address prior to the invasion of the Soviet Union on the 30th of March 1941, when he talked about the ideological war. What is the ideology? The ideology is the defeat of Bolshevism, which is Jewish. Now, there is, you see, a problem there. What is not there in this quote? The living space. Supposedly the reason why they wanted a war. Not the reason, because if you defeat Bolshevism, which rules over the living space, it rules over the Ukraine and the Caucasus and so on. If you defeat that, then in any case, the living space is yours, because then you have defeated Bolshevism, which is Jewish, and the Jews who are the Bolsheviks. Where are the capitalists there? The Jewish capitalists. He was after the Jewish capitalists, after all, not only against the Jewish Bolsheviks, right? The answer to that is a public speech, which anyone who takes, in a college or university course today in the West, the Holocaust as a topic. That's Holocaust Studies 101. Any BA student reads it, has to read it. It's the famous speech of Hitler on the 30th of January, 1939, to the German Reichstag, in which, it's a long speech, which deals with the whole question of what to do with the word. And in that speech, as anyone who knows the speech by heart, Hitler says that if a new world war should break out, it would be the result of a conspiracy of the German financiers in and outside of Europe, who already caused First World War, and now they would cause the Second World War. And the purpose, he says so explicitly, The purpose of the Jewish financiers and capitalists is to have Bolshevism rule the world. And we know that Bolshevism is Jewish, and the Jews are Bolshevik. And the purpose of Bolshevism is the rule of international Jewry. And then he says, if that happens, the result will not be the victory of Bolshevism, and thereby the victory of Jewry, but the annihilation of the Jewish race in Europe. I would ask to talk about Barbarossa. I cannot talk about Barbarossa without talking Holocaust, because they are connected, very, very closely connected. And my argument, and it is an argument that I've put forward, and interestingly enough, you know, there are all kinds of arguments amongst historians and so on and so forth about this interpretation and that interpretation. But on this crucial central point, my colleagues, with some exceptions, have kept quiet. Because what does it mean? It means that World War II, which in Europe caused 35 million dead, according to figures that were published, 5.6 to 5.8 million of them were Jews who died in the Holocaust. A figure of 6 million is the Nazi figure. So 29 million non-Jews died because of anti-Semitism, right? 29 million reasons to oppose anti-Semitism. 29 million reasons that cause us to remember World War II, that cause us to remember Barbarossa. Thank you.
Folks, if anybody has questions, please just type them in the chat so Professor Bauer can read them and address them.
How important were the Einsatzgruppen to Operation Barbarossa? Yes, the Einsatzgruppen were, there were 4 Einsatzgruppen which met before the invasion of the Soviet Union on the 17th of June, 1941, a few days before the invasion, in a place called Brecht in East Germany, under Heydrich, the head policeman of Himmler. And they dealt with the Jewish issue. And the Einsatzgruppen was supposed to eliminate, at first in a very vague formulation, all Jewish clerks, people working for the Soviet regime, and then immediately after that, all Jewish men. And the idea of a total annihilation of the Jews grew as the invasion went on. There was no prior decision of the Germans to annihilate the Jewish people before the invasion of the Soviet Union. It was the logical development of it, because before that, the Nazis wanted to deport all the Jews of Europe to outside of Europe, or first into the Soviet Union, while there was still peace with the Soviet Union, then to Madagascar in Africa. And when that proved to be impossible, the solution was to kill all of them. And then that developed into a plan. The planning went on while the killing went on. And finally, the idea by November 1941 was to plan the killing of all the Jews everywhere in the world. So the Einsatzgruppen were staged in this, and the stage was very important. The 4 Einsatzgruppen, and they killed, according to one major researcher, about 1.1 million Jews, just the Einsatzgruppen alone. What about the war in Asia? Did this not also inspire Hitler? Hitler had no real relationship with his allies, with the Japanese. He, of course, was fully aware of the Japanese opposition to the United States, but he was not privy to the ideas of attacking Pearl Harbor. And when Pearl Harbor was attacked on the 7th of December 1941, he had no agreement with the Japanese to enter the war against the Soviet Union. Nevertheless, and despite the fact that he had no agreement, on the 11th of December, in other words, 4 days after Pearl Harbor, Hitler, without consulting his military, by the way, declared war on the United States. Without that declaration of war, I wonder whether the United States would have joined the war in Europe at that point, probably later, but not then, because there was tremendous opposition in the Congress to any participation of the United States in a war in Europe. And it was the war declaration by Germany, by Hitler, on the United States that left the United States no choice but to enter the war in Europe. Was Stalin convinced after Pearl Harbor that he didn't have to worry about attack from Japan? Yes, exactly. Even before Pearl Harbor, the preparations, without him knowing, without Hitler knowing the details of the Japanese planning, it was quite clear that the Japanese were worried about the Anglo-Americans because they needed the oil, and the oil was in the hands of the Dutch and so on, and they were protected by the Western powers. So Hitler was not worried anymore, and Stalin was not worried anymore about an attack from Japan. What was Stalin's response early in the invasion? Didn't he go into hiding for a few weeks? No, he didn't go into hiding, but he was completely confused, and he made contrary declarations to his nearest friends. Fortunately, he had a marvelous chief of staff. Boris Shapochnikov was his name. He's very little known in the West. He was actually brain behind the Soviet opposition to the Germans. And there is a report, which I can't guarantee that it's accurate, that in a sudden expression of despair, Stalin looked at a monument in the memory of Lenin and said, "Look, Lenin prepared us for this, and look what we did with it." In other words, he was in a desperate mood, and it took him several days until the 3rd of July to gather himself together and to make a speech to the Soviet people. And that speech started the beginning of a sort of a reawakening of Stalin as a leader and so on. Successful or not successful is another question, but as a leader to present himself to the Soviet people. And one has to say that the Soviet soldiers in masses went to their deaths in battle, crying for motherland and for Stalin. Za rodinu, za Stalina. That was, so Stalin was important. Could you please comment on the historiography literature regarding the origins of Barbarossa and how it evolved in recent years? There's a constant stream of analysis, recently also by Russian historians and Russian Jews who immigrated to Israel, like Professor Gorodetsky, who is a major participant in this discussion, who deal with the details. Much of the details that I presented to you comes from these people. And of course, there are very major historians in the West who have dealt with this, like Ian Kershaw in the UK and many others, including people who deal specifically with the Holocaust too, like Christopher Browning and others. So there's a tremendous bibliography that one can collect, and all you have to do is to go to people to Google to find out what the bibliography is. Please, a few words about the consequences of the Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact concerning the forced migration of Romanian Bessarabian Jews from Bessarabia, Moldova, and Bukovina to Romania. Now, the Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact of the 23rd of August 1939 came after an attempt by the Soviets to create an alliance with the West, with Britain and France. Chamberlain and Daladier, from the UK and France, were not really interested in this, but they could not very well refuse a Soviet offer to discuss. And they sent a delegation to Leningrad in July 1939, led by a retired British admiral and a second-rate French general. The British Admiral Drax, did not even have a paper that would present him as a plenipotentiary in the discussions with the Soviet government. And the Soviets, the Marshal Voroshilov, Clemente Voroshilov, who was a friend of Stalin's, not a very great brain, but a kind of a half diplomat, half military person. Voroshilov asked the delegates, the French and the British, if there was a common front against the Germans. First of all, what would the French and the British contribute? And the French said, we would fight behind the Maginot Line, the defense line between France and Germany, which did not extend to Luxembourg and Belgium, which is the area where the Germans afterwards went through. And the British said, we would send 2 divisions to France, 2 divisions, yeah? Because in fact, in 1938, you know, the British had 6 divisions all over the British Empire that could face an enemy. 2 of them were in Palestine, by the way, fighting the Arab rebellion. Okay. Now, when Voroshilov heard that, he said, okay, you have the agreement of Poland that we could go through Poland to face the Germans. And the French and the British said, no, the Poles don't want that. That was the end of that. And so the Soviets really had no choice, objectively speaking, if they wanted to avoid a war against the Germans, which they, under all circumstances, wanted to avoid, to fight alone. And so they made the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. Romanian Bessarabian Jews from Bessarabia, Moldova, did not go to Romania. That's a legend. There were a few people who managed to escape. They were caught, first of all, by the Soviets, who in 1940 occupied Bessarabia and Moldova and northern Bukovina. And then the Germans came, and the Jews did not escape anywhere. They were killed or deported into Transnistria, to an area that was occupied by the Romanians and the Germans in what is today Moldova and Transnistria. So there are legends, but those are details, really. I could go into details, but I don't think that that's what you want. Might you elaborate on the reasons for and ways in which the Barbarossa invasion was able to recruit and find support from the local population? Local population where? In the Soviet Union? In parts of the Soviet Union, especially in the Ukraine. They agreed to they thought the Germans would win the war. And so they collaborated with the Germans. From the very beginning, by the way, there were small groups of local population who opposed the German invasion. And then as the Germans advanced in the Ukraine, there was more massive support for the Germans, also because of pressure by the Germans, but also because in the Ukraine, the Soviets in the 1930s had artificially caused a tremendous destruction by hunger of the local Ukrainian peasantry in 1932, 1933. And so many Ukrainians would turn against the Soviets and in favor of the Germans. Now, paradoxically, many young Ukrainians, before the Germans managed to occupy the Ukraine, were recruited into the Soviet army. And so the local Ukrainians were torn between the support of their sons and husbands who were fighting in the Soviet army on the one hand, and their sympathy for the German occupation because it was anti-Soviet. And so you have Ukrainians of all kinds and who supported this and who supported that. Many, I would say the majority of the Ukrainians supported the final solution, the mass murder of the Jews, because they got the property of the Jews out of that. That was a major purpose. And so there were Ukrainian policemen who participated in the murder of the Jews. It says, it asks me, but the persecution as in encouraging the local population to kill or humiliate the Jews began on day one of Operation Barbarossa. So there was a plan to make their lives unbearable. There was a plan to kill all the men, first of all, a few days after the operation. Yes, on the first day as well. Sure. The women and children, by the way, on that first day were not killed. The men were killed. Women and children were killed a few days afterwards. So it was a progress like that. It was not to make their lives unbearable, it was to kill them. Ultimately, in the meantime, they would be utilized for forced labor, you know, in the ghettos that were established. What about the Wannsee Conference? The Wannsee Conference took place on the 20th of January, 1942, which is 6 months after the beginning of Barbarossa, while millions of Jews were already either killed or in danger of being killed. So the Wannsee Conference was not a place to decide about the final solution, but a conference, an administrative conference, to discuss how to do it. Now, not everything that was done at the Wannsee Conference actually was afterwards executed, but the idea was to organize the various German departments that dealt with the Jews under one leadership, the leadership of Heydrich, of the SS, and task the SS to be in charge of the killing of the Jews. That was the purpose of the Wannsee Conference. Do we have any idea as to Stalin's understanding as to why Hitler invaded? Did he see it in terms of ideology? There's no answer to that question. We don't know what Stalin thought. We just don't know. We know what he did. He claimed that it was an attack on the Soviet peoples and so on and so forth. He did not talk in terms of genocide, of what later became genocide, because the term genocide was coined by Raphael Lemkin in 1943, 1944, and we're talking about 1941. So he did not use terminology that is parallel to that. He used nationalistic ideology, rightly so, because he thereby mobilized the Soviet people, some of whom were not so happy with communism, as on a nationalist basis. You are defending the fatherland or motherland. And I, Stalin, am your guarantee to fight that. And he got the support of the Russian Orthodox Church, some of whose bishops were supporting the Germans in German-occupied Soviet Russia. But Stalin took great care not to attack the Orthodox Church because of that. And he got the support of the clergy, of the Orthodox clergy under Soviet command. Do you consider Barbarossa Hitler's greatest strategic mistake, although ideologically driven, or Hitler's declaration of war on the US on 11th December 1941? I think that his very attack on the Soviet Union was the major mistake, but it was ideologically motivated. It could not be prevented because the whole Nazi empire was motivated by ideology. It was not motivated by pragmatic reasons. Pragmatic reasons were used in order to justify the ideology, but you can't really ask that question in a way. You can't say that something was Hitler's greatest mistake, because the greatest mistake was was Hitler. That was the mistake. And Hitler was ideology. Hitler and the top Nazi party leaders, there were 50, 60 people who were the immediate environment of Hitler. And they certainly supported his ideology. Can you comment on the pre-invasion meeting of May 29, 1941, which focused on turning invaded peoples against the Jewish populace? May 1921, I know May 30. Maybe we think of the same meeting. It was not really turning the peoples against their Jewish populace. It was the explanation to top military leaders why an ideological war against the Soviet Union was essential. Please explain the locals in Letland who voluntarily started killing the Jews, for example, in Riga. Not only in Riga, in Lithuania and Latvia. That was part of the Nazi propaganda, which was based on a violent nationalism, local nationalism. But the local nationalism thought that the Germans would support Lithuanian or Latvian autonomy under German rule. And the Germans never intended that. Germans wanted direct rule. In fact, according to a plan which they hatched in 1941 and then expanded in 1942 and 1943, which is called General Plan East, or in German Generalplan Ost, which in effect asked for an elimination of the Baltic peoples by turning them into Germans or by using them as helpers to exercise German rule in the occupied Soviet Union, or by killing them. There was an explicit statement like that. So when the Latvians and the Lithuanians began killing the Jews, they killed them because they thought the Jews were communists, which was not true. But that was the propaganda. And so you have in both, especially in Lithuania, but also in Latvia, most of the Jews were killed by local people under German orders. The German order, the German supervision in Lithuania, for instance, was minimal. There were a few dozen Germans who supervised the killing of the Jews. By the way, the German officer who was in charge of organizing the German supervision of Lithuanians killing Jews was called, to anyone who knows Jewish history, was called Joachim Haman. Haman was in the Scroll of Esther, the supposed Persian persecutor and killer of Jews. His name was Haman.
Professor Bauer, given the lateness of the hour, I think we do need to conclude, and I'd just like to call Michael G. to propose a vote of thanks to you for your outstanding lecture.
Okay.
Michael, if you could just unmute, please.
Professor Bauer, you have delivered the most fascinating lecture and information. And frankly, seeing all the questions appearing on the screen in front of me, it amazes me that people's knowledge is as limited as it is after all these years. You've opened a lot of people's eyes, which is very, very welcome. It's been absolutely fascinating. As I said, a great honor to have you here with us. And from the point of view of Yad Vashem, well, they can speak for themselves, but the memory of all those Jewish people killed, and the only place in the world where every name that we know about is recorded is very important. Yad Vashem carries out a hugely important job. But all in all, we are delighted and honored that you've spoken to us in such great detail and so useful. And we just wish you well and to keep going. You are a remarkable and amazing man. So, Toda Rabah, Laila Tov. Thank you very, very much indeed.
Thank you.